I was hanging a bag of saline in room 6 when my phone vibrated against my hip. Tuesday morning, mid-January. The kind of cold that seeps through hospital walls regardless of what the thermostat says. The ward smelled like antiseptic and the burned coffee that comes out of the break room machine around 6 a.m. My patient, a man named Mr. Horvath who had been coming to the cardiac unit for 3 years now, was watching the morning news with the volume too low to hear. I almost silenced the call. My hands were already busy. But I saw the area code, 9112 Savannah. And something in my chest pulled before I even answered. It was my grandmother's neighbor, a woman named Agnes, who had been her closest friend for 37 years. She was crying before she finished saying my name. She told me my grandmother, Ruby Delane Pickett, had suffered a massive stroke at some point in the night. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was already gone. She was 79 years old. She had gone quietly, in her own house, in the bed where she had slept for 51 years. I stood there with the saline tube still in my hand. Mr. Horvath muted the television without me asking. I don't remember much of the drive home. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something about my grandmother. Not the surface version. Not the one my mother liked to describe at dinner parties in a tone that was somewhere between affectionate and condescending. I mean the real version. My grandmother grew up in coastal Georgia with nothing. Her father worked the docks in Brunswick. Her mother took in laundry. Ruby left school at 17 to help support the family, and by 22, she was cooking out of a second-hand truck she had bought with money she saved, by eating one meal a day for 14 months. She parked that truck outside the shipyard on River Street in Savannah, and she sold red beans and rice, and her mother's cornbread and peach cobbler, that people still talk about today. She worked alone for 4 years. Then she hired one person, then two. By the time I was born, she had 3 locations of Ruby's home kitchen. The original on River Street, one in Pooler, one in Bluffton, South Carolina, and somewhere between 40 and 50 employees depending on the season. She had a house on Habersham Street that she had paid for in cash. She kept the same truck in the driveway, the one she'd started with, because she said it reminded her of who she was before anyone else cared. My mother, Beverly, was Ruby's only child. She had grown up helping in the restaurant, but she had also grown up watching her mother work herself to exhaustion for decades, and somewhere along the way, she had decided that that was not going to be her life. She married my father, Stuart, when she was 24. My father was an estate attorney with a practice in Hilton Head. They moved north of the island, bought a house in a gated community, and started building a life that announced itself loudly from the street. My mother loved my grandmother, I genuinely believe that, but she was also ashamed of her in ways she would never say directly. She called the restaurant Mama's Diner. She never brought her friends there. When my grandmother came to visit, my mother would watch her hands. The wide, work-roughened hands of a woman who had been cooking professionally since before my mother was born. And there was something in my mother's eyes I could not name as a child but understand completely now. My Uncle Keith was my mother's younger brother. He had never built anything. He had worked in sales, then insurance, then some kind of real estate venture that he spoke about in vague terms that never seemed to add up to anything concrete. What he was very good at was proximity. For the last 8 years of my grandmother's life, he had inserted himself into her world. He helped her with the restaurant accounts, he said. He sat in on meetings with her business manager. He told her she needed him, and she was aging, and she shouldn't have to carry so much alone. She let him in because she was generous, and because he was her son, and because she believed the best about people even when the evidence did not support it. I was not like my mother, and I was not like my uncle. I was the one who showed up. Every other Sunday for 7 years, I made the drive from Charleston to Savannah. I would arrive mid-morning, and we would sit at her kitchen table, and she would put a cup of coffee in front of me, and a plate of something she had made that morning. Biscuits, or skins with fig preserves, or the sweet potato heiltsaunke that I have never tasted anywhere else in my life. And we would talk for hours. Not about anything important. About her customers, about the young cook she had just hired, about whether she should redo the floors at the River Street location. She asked about my patients. She remembered their names when I told them to her, and she asked about them the following Sunday. She had taught me to cook in that kitchen, not just the mechanics of it. I mean the feeling of it. She taught me that cooking for people is an act of attention. It says, I thought about what you like. I made this for you specifically. She taught me her peach cobbler and her red velvet cake from memory, standing beside me with her hand over mine, adjusting the pressure of my palm against the dough. She never wrote those recipes down. She said the recipe wasn't in the measurements. It was in the hands. When I was 22 and told my parents I wanted to go to nursing school, my father said I was smart enough for medical school and shouldn't settle. My mother said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. My grandmother wrote me a check for the full 2-year RN program at MUSC, and slid it across the table without discussion. She said, "People who take care of other people are the most important kind. Now eat something." I kept nursing. I worked in the cardiac unit at Roper Hospital in Charleston for 6 years. My apartment was small and my car had a slow leak in the rear left tire that I kept meaning to fix. I loved my work in the way you love something that is difficult and necessary, the way you love something that asks everything from you on the hard days and gives it back on the good ones. The funeral was held at 2nd Baptist on Whitaker Street, where my grandmother had attended every Sunday for 40 years. The church was full. I had not expected that. People I did not know walked up to me and held my hands and told me about the meal she had brought them when a parent died, the job she had given a nephew who couldn't find work, the time she had quietly paid a family's overdue tab and told them not to mention it. A woman in her 70s who introduced herself as a retired schoolteacher said that my grandmother had catered her daughter's graduation party for free because she had heard the family was struggling and that she had not found out until years later. She pressed my hand and walked away without waiting for a response. My Uncle Keith delivered the eulogy. It was the longest I had ever heard him speak without talking about himself. 10 days after the funeral, we were called to the office of Philip Greer, the estate attorney my grandmother had worked with for the last 12 years. His office was on Bull Street, in a building across from Forsyth Park. Dark wood, tall windows, a framed gula basket on the wall that my grandmother had given him years ago, he told me later. He had coffee waiting. My mother sat with her hands folded. My Uncle Keith sat with his ankle on his knee, leaning back slightly. The posture of a man who has already decided how this ends. His son Ashton, my cousin, 26 years old, and working for Keith's insurance business, was there too, glancing at his phone under the table. Philip reviewed the estate summary. Total assets. The 3 restaurant locations, the house on Habersham Street, investment accounts, and 2 small commercial properties in Savannah's historic district. All of it valued at approximately $22 million. He looked up. "The entirety of the estate," he said, "is bequeathed to one beneficiary." The room didn't move. Calloway Renee Pickett. My full name, the name my grandmother had given me, Calloway, her own mother's surname, was one nobody used except her. She had called me Callie in person, and Calloway Renee in writing, and hearing Philip say it in that room, I understood that she had put it there on purpose. My uncle's ankle came off his knee. My mother turned to look at me the way she might look at a stranger. Philip slid the document across the table. My uncle reached for it first. Philip placed his hand firmly over the page and slid it the rest of the way to me. She anticipated questions, Philip said, about her state of mind. She prepared something. He turned his laptop around on the desk. My grandmother was sitting in her kitchen, the same chair she always sat in, closest to the window. The morning light was coming in behind her and the kitchen smelled. I could almost smell it through the screen, like coffee in the cedar sachet she kept in the cabinet above the sink. She had done her hair. She was wearing her good blue blouse, the one she wore to church. She looked directly at the camera with the steadiness of someone who has said everything they need to say and knows it. She said, "If you're watching this, I'm gone. I want you to know I made this decision with a clear head and a full heart. And if anyone tells you otherwise, Philip has the documents to prove them wrong." She smiled a little at that. "Calloway, baby, I want to start with you. You showed up. You showed up for 7 years, every other Sunday, not because there was anything in it for you, but because that's who you are. You sat at my table and ate my food and asked me how I was feeling, and actually waited for the answer. You learned to make the cobbler the right way. You know what that means, and I don't need to explain it to you." She paused and looked down for a moment, then back up. "Beverly, I love you, and I know you think I don't see what's happened over the years. I see it. I've always seen it. You are my child, and you will always be my child, and I leave you out of this will with love, not anger. But I built something with my hands, and I know who will carry it forward." Then she looked directly into the lens and said, "Keith, I know about the accounts." The room was very still. "I know about the consulting fees you paid yourself without authorization. I know about the vendor arrangement you changed without telling me. Philip has the full accounting. The estate will handle it accordingly." She folded her hands on the table. "I spent my whole life watching what people do when they think no one is paying attention. I paid attention. I saw what I needed to see." The screen went dark. What happened in that office after the video ended, I will not describe in full. My uncle stood up. He used a word I will not repeat. Ashton knocked his chair back when he got up. My mother sat very still with her hands still folded, and when she finally looked at me, I saw something in her face I could not entirely read. They asked me to come to my mother's house that evening. I went, because I wanted to believe there was still something worth talking about. There wasn't. My uncle had documents. Not legal documents, papers he had drafted himself, a proposal to establish a family management trust for the estate. The restaurants would be overseen by the trust. He would serve as trustee. I would receive distributions as the sole beneficiary, he said. A percentage to be determined. Generous, he said. He said the word generous 4 times in 15 minutes. You're a nurse, my mother said. She meant it as a fact, but it landed like a verdict. You cannot run 3 restaurant locations. This protects you. I looked at the papers on the coffee table. I thought about my grandmother's hands over mine in that kitchen. The weight of her palm adjusting the pressure of mine against the dough. The recipe that was never written down. No, I said. My uncle told me I was making a decision I would regret. My mother said I was being naive. Ashton said nothing but looked at me with a contempt that was somehow worse than anything his father said. I left. Philip called me before I had reached the highway. He told me to drive to Savannah and come to my grandmother's house. He would meet me there in the morning, with coffee and something to eat, and everything I needed to know. He was on the front porch when I pulled up just after 7 a.m., 2 cups from the bakery on Broughton Street, a paper bag, a leather briefcase that looked like it carried things of consequence. He came inside and opened a folder on the kitchen table. Then another, then a third. My grandmother had been keeping records for 2.5 years. A journal. Not a diary, a deliberate ledger. Documenting every unauthorized transaction my uncle Keith had made. Consulting fees he had added to the payroll without her approval. A supply vendor he had switched for one that turned out to be his wife's cousin's company, at margins 15% higher than the previous contract. 3 cash withdrawals from the restaurant safe, all made by my uncle, none accounted for in the books. Philip had cross-referenced everything with a forensic accountant. The total came to just over $160,000. Then Philip opened his laptop. The footage was from the security system at the Habersham Street house. My grandmother had upgraded the cameras 18 months before she died. She had not mentioned it to anyone. The timestamp read 2 days after the funeral. My uncle's car in the driveway. He and Ashton coming through the front door with the spare key. My uncle going directly, not wandering, not looking around, directly to the cabinet above the refrigerator where my grandmother kept a wooden box. Inside that box, her mother's pearl drop earrings, a garnet ring she wore every Christmas, a gold chain that had belonged to her own grandmother, passed down through 4 generations of women in this family, and a small manila envelope containing $400 in cash that she kept for household emergencies. Ashton stood at the front door with his arms crossed while my uncle emptied that box into his jacket pocket. They left without touching anything else. My grandmother had installed the cameras because she had seen this coming. 2 days later, I was sitting in that same kitchen when the front door opened, and Agnes walked in with a foil-covered casserole dish and a look on her face that said she had been waiting for this moment for some time. She set the dish on the counter, sat down across from me, and placed a second journal on the table. Her own, she said, recording every conversation she had witnessed over the last 3 years. Every time my uncle had pressured my grandmother to restructure the restaurant's operating accounts. Every time he had referred to himself as, basically co-owner, to people who didn't know better. Jerome arrived an hour later. He had been the head cook at the River Street location for 23 years. He was 61 years old, and had hands almost as work-worn as my grandmother's. He sat at the table without being asked, and spread out his own set of documents, internal payroll records he had kept copies of, because he had noticed the discrepancies in the supply costs 2 years ago, and had not known what to do with them until my grandmother had quietly asked him to hold on to everything. He said she had told him, "When the time comes, Jerome, you'll know." Philip had reached out to Judge Mabel Osterhaus, who had grown up 4 blocks from my grandmother's childhood home in Brunswick, and who had eaten at Ruby's every Saturday morning for 22 years. She arrived that afternoon in a blazer and reading glasses and said, simply, that she had spent the better part of a week reviewing the estate documents, and found them to be entirely without legal challenge. The next morning, my uncle and my cousin arrived at the house, expecting to find me alone. They found the kitchen table full. Agnes, Jerome, Philip, Judge Osterhaus, a retired Chatham County Sheriff's deputy, who had been a regular customer of my grandmother's for 15 years, and who had quietly shown up that morning because Agnes had called him. My uncle did what he always did, he performed. He pointed at me and called it a circus. He called Philip a hired gun. He said my grandmother had not been in her right mind for months, and that anyone who said otherwise was lying. Philip let him finish. Then he turned the laptop around and played the security footage. My uncle went very quiet. Philip placed the forensic accounting summary on the coffee table. He placed Agnes's journal beside that. He placed Jerome's payroll records beside that. Judge Osterhaus looked at my uncle steadily and said, "The estate has legal grounds to pursue criminal charges for the theft documented in this footage. The financial irregularities constitute a separate civil matter. Both will proceed unless full restitution is made within 30 days, at which point the estate may choose not to pursue further action. That choice belongs to Ms. Pickett." My cousin Ashton looked at the floor. My uncle looked at me. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he picked up his jacket and walked to the door. My cousin followed him. The door closed. Agnes put her hand over mine on the table. Over the following weeks, the estate was transferred into my name without legal challenge. The jewelry was returned, through Philip's office, within 10 days. My uncle made full restitution of the $162,000 over the following month. Documented, filed, finalized. No criminal charges were pursued. My grandmother would not have wanted that, and I knew it without having to think about it. I hired a restaurant management group out of Atlanta that specialized in independent family-owned locations. I kept Jerome as head of kitchen operations. He knew those restaurants better than anyone alive, and my grandmother had trusted him with the only thing she trusted completely, which was her recipes and her people. I spent 3 Saturdays standing at the line at the River Street location, before I touched a single management decision. Watching how service moved, learning what my grandmother had understood for 50 years. That the people doing the work are the ones who know what the work actually requires. I found her foundation plans in a folder in the back of her desk drawer. She had been working on it for 2 years. A scholarship fund for first-generation college students in coastal Georgia. A supply grant for underfunded school kitchens in Chatham and Bryan counties. A culinary apprenticeship program attached to the restaurant for young people aging out of foster care. Something she had researched carefully. Something she had cared about deeply without ever mentioning to me once. I funded it with $4.5 million in the first year. I named it the Ruby Delane Pickett Community Foundation. Her full name, which most people who knew her never heard. I kept nursing. I still work 3 days a week in the cardiac unit at Roper. My patients have no idea what my life looks like outside those walls, and that is exactly how it should be. The money changed what I can do. It did not change why I show up. I live in my grandmother's house on Habersham Street now. It smells like cedar and 50 years of good cooking, and I have not changed anything about it, except the bedding and a leaking faucet in the guest bathroom. Her cast iron skillets are still hanging in the same order on the same wall hooks where she kept them. Her recipe journals. The ones that contain everything except the peach cobbler and the red velvet cake, which live only in my hands now, are on the shelf above the stove, where they have always been. Every other Sunday, the kitchen table is full. Agnes comes. Jerome brings his wife. Philip has become something that does not have a clean name, not quite family, not quite friend, something more reliable than both. 2 nurses from my unit come sometimes. Last month, one of the young apprentices from the River Street program came for the first time and sat quietly through the whole dinner eating 2 helpings of everything before she laughed at something. Jerome said. And when she laughed, the whole table shifted and became something better. Nobody performs at these dinners. Nobody is keeping a list of who brought what or tracking a score that no one has named out loud. We argue about Georgia football, and whether the Bluffton location needs new signage, and whether Agnes's cornbread is better with or without jalapenos. She says without. Jerome says she is wrong. I have learned to stay out of it. We eat until it becomes unreasonable to eat more, and then we eat a little more. And by the time people start leaving, it is late. And the dishes are done, and the house feels the way it did when she was in it. That is what my grandmother left me. Not the restaurants, not the house or the foundation or the $22 million. Though all of it matters, all of it is real, and I am not pretending otherwise. She left me proof of something I had not known how to say out loud before she died. That the life you build with your hands and your integrity does not stay with you alone. It spreads out. It moves through every person you treated fairly, every worker whose name you learned, every customer whose story you took the time to remember. It comes back not in money and not to you. You won't need it to come back to you. It comes back in the form of a retired judge sitting at your kitchen table because she loved the same woman you loved, and that was enough reason to show up. My mother called me 3 months after the estate was settled. The conversation was short and careful, and we did not say most of what needed saying. We are trying. It is slow. I do not know what it will become, and I have stopped trying to decide that in advance. What I know is this. My grandmother saw everything. She saw all of us. She watched every choice my mother made, and every choice my uncle made, and every other Sunday I drove down and sat in that kitchen chair without being asked, and at the end of 50 years of watching, she made her decision with clear eyes and full hands and left nothing to chance. If you have ever felt like the quiet one, the one who doesn't register, the one whose work is invisible because it doesn't announce itself in a room. I want you to hear this. The people who are really paying attention are paying attention, not loudly, not in ways that will show up until you least expect them. But they are watching, and what you do when no one seems to notice is exactly what they will remember the longest. My grandmother saw me. That is the inheritance no document could have given me, and no one could have taken away.